A dying lion appears at his rescuer's funeral. What he does next will break your heart. The silence of the cemetery was broken by a sound no one expected to hear in that place, in that moment of grief and farewell. It was not the wind rustling through the acacia trees, nor the distant call of a weaver bird. It was something heavy, rhythmic, almost deliberate. Footsteps. Footsteps that made the dry earth crack under an immense weight, each step echoing between the weathered headstones and the simple wooden crosses that marked the graves of those who had lived and died in the shadow of the African savanna. The mourners gathered around the open casket turned their heads in confusion. Some still had tears streaming down their faces. Others clutched bouquets of white lilies that trembled in their hands. The priest stopped mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on something beyond the shoulders of the grieving crowd, his mouth open, the words dying in his throat before they could be spoken. And then he appeared. A massive silhouette emerged from between the fever trees at the edge of the cemetery, where the wild bush began to swallow the golden light of late afternoon. The shape was impossible, absurd even, but it was there, solid and real. A lion, a male, fully grown, with a dark mane that had thinned with age and hardship, muscles visible beneath a coat that stretched too tight over prominent ribs. His eyes, amber and deep like ancient wells, swept across the group of humans with an intensity that paralyzed everyone who met his gaze. He stood at least 1.10 meters at the shoulder. His weight, though diminished by whatever suffering he had endured, was still easily 180 kilograms of raw power. And yet, there was no aggression in his approach. No raised hackles, no bared teeth. Just purpose, just determination, and something else that humans rarely associate with wild animals: grief. David Reeves, 61 years old, sat in a wooden chair beside the open casket. His hands trembled as they clutched a white handkerchief soaked with tears. He had spent 34 years as a senior ranger in this reserve, and his wife, Grace, had spent 40 years as its head veterinarian. He thought he had seen everything the savanna could offer. He thought nothing could surprise him anymore. But today was different. In the casket lay the body of Grace Reeves, 76 years old. Her face was serene, touched with makeup that softened the lines that time and sun had carved into her skin. Her hands were crossed over her chest, holding a small photograph of her and David on their wedding day, 58 years ago. She wore a simple blue dress, the same one she wore to church every Sunday. Her white hair was pulled back in a braid that gave her a final dignity. The lion continued forward. Each step was measured, careful, as if he was navigating not just physical space, but something far more sacred. His massive paws left deep prints in the dry cemetery soil. That was when the guards reacted. 2 rangers who had been providing security for the funeral drew their weapons in one fluid motion. The metallic click of safeties being released cut through the air like a blade. "Everyone back!" one of them shouted. "Do not move!" The lion stopped, his great head turned toward the armed men, and for a moment his amber eyes assessed the threat. But he did not retreat. His gaze moved past them, found the casket, and he took another step forward. "He is going to charge!" the second guard yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "I am taking the shot!" David rose from his chair. His legs shook beneath him. His heart hammered against his ribs. But when he spoke, his voice came out steady and clear, stronger than it had been in months. "Lower your weapons. Now." Every eye in the cemetery turned to the old man. David walked forward, his steps slow but deliberate, and placed himself directly between the guards and the lion. His frail body became the only shield standing between 200 kilograms of wild predator and the bullets meant to stop him. "Mr. Reeves," one guard said, his weapon still raised, "you need to move. That animal is dangerous." David did not move. "I know this lion. My wife saved his life 12 years ago. If you shoot him, you will have to shoot me first." The words hung in the air like smoke. The guards exchanged a look. Uncertainty flickered in their eyes. Slowly, reluctantly, the barrels lowered. The weapons were holstered. David turned to face the lion. Their eyes met. Blue faded by age and amber burning with something that transcended instinct. And in that moment, David saw it. Recognition. The lion knew him. The lion remembered. The great cat closed the remaining distance to the casket. The mourners parted like water before a stone, pressing against each other. Their fear mixed now with something else. Awe, reverence, the sense that they were witnessing something that would be told and retold for generations. The lion stopped at the edge of the casket, and gently, with a tenderness that seemed impossible for jaws that could crush bone, he opened his mouth and deposited something on the white satin lining, right beside Grace's still hand. It was a piece of braided leather, weathered and faded, the edges frayed by years of exposure. A simple thing, insignificant to anyone who did not know its history. But David knew. His breath caught in his chest, his vision blurred with fresh tears. "Coda," he whispered. The lion turned his head at the sound of the name, and David saw it then, the confirmation he needed. A deep scar running down the right hind leg, from the hip almost to the ankle. A scar that David had watched his wife clean and bandage and treat with antibiotics every day for 3 months. 12 years ago. 12 years ago, in the heart of the dry season, when the temperature reached 43 degrees and the earth cracked like old pottery, Grace had found a lion cub alone in the bush. He was perhaps 4 months old, crying in a voice that was more whimper than roar. His mother lay dead 200 meters away, shot by poachers who had taken her skin and left her body to rot. But the cub had not been shot. He had been caught. A wire snare, set by hunters who did not care what they trapped, had closed around his right hind leg. The metal had cut through skin, through muscle, all the way to the bone. Infection had already begun to set in. The smell of rotting flesh mixed with the copper tang of blood. Any other person would have called for a team, would have waited for equipment, would have assessed the risk. Grace did not wait. She worked for 2 hours under that brutal sun, cutting away the wire millimeter by millimeter, flushing the wound with the limited water she carried, improvising a splint from branches and strips torn from her own shirt. The cub screamed and thrashed, but she held him, talked to him, sang to him in a voice that David always said could calm a thunderstorm. When she finally carried him back to their home, David thought she had lost her mind. A lion cub in their house, a wild predator drinking milk from a bottle in their kitchen. But he did not stop her. He never could. For 3 years, Coda lived with them. Grace fed him every 3 hours those first months, setting alarms that woke her through the night. She cleaned his wound daily, watching the infection retreat, watching the tissue heal, watching the scar form that would mark him forever. She made him a collar of braided leather, simple and soft, just to get him used to human touch. And when he outgrew the collar, he carried it in his mouth anyway, as if it was the only piece of his mother he had left. David complained about the smell, complained about the torn furniture, the midnight roaring, the way Coda would steal food from the counter when they were not looking. But every night, he found Grace asleep on the floor beside the growing lion, her hand resting on his golden fur, and he could not bring himself to say another word. When Coda was 3 years old, fully grown, his mane beginning to darken, Grace made the decision that broke her heart. He needed to be wild. He needed to be free. He needed to be what he was born to be. She drove him to the edge of the reserve herself. David came along, though he told himself it was just to make sure she was safe. She removed the collar, kissed his great forehead, and told him to go, to live, to find a pride, and become the king he was meant to be. Coda walked into the tall grass, and then he stopped. He turned his massive head and looked back at Grace. Their eyes held for 10 seconds that stretched into eternity. She raised her hand in a small wave, tears streaming down her face. Then he was gone, swallowed by the savanna. Grace never saw him again. She looked for him sometimes, on her patrols, scanning the horizon for a lion with a scarred hind leg. But the bush kept its secrets, and Coda had become one of them. 9 years passed. Grace grew older, slower. The cancer came quietly at first, then with a vengeance that no amount of veterinary knowledge could fight. In her final weeks, she would sit on the porch of their home, looking out at the savanna, and David knew she was still looking for him. She never stopped believing he would come back. Now, standing beside her casket, Coda was finally here. The lion did not move from his position. His great head hung low, his nose inches from Grace's still form. His nostrils flared, taking in her scent, the scent that had meant safety and love and home for the first 3 years of his life. But now it was mixed with something else. The stillness, the absence, the terrible finality of death. David walked slowly to Coda's side. The mourners held their breath. The guards' hands hovered near their weapons, ready but uncertain. David reached out and placed his palm on Coda's shoulder. The fur was coarse beneath his fingers, warm with the heat of a body that had traveled who knew how many kilometers to be here. Coda turned his head and looked at David, and there was no threat in those amber eyes. Only recognition, only shared loss. The lion sat down, right there beside the casket, beside the old man who had grumbled about the smell, but left the door open every night. He sat like a sentinel, like a son who had come to stand vigil. David sat down too, in his wooden chair, his hand still resting on Coda's mane, and they stayed like that as the priest, his voice trembling now, resumed the funeral rites. The casket was lowered into the earth. The sound of ropes creaking through the pulleys filled the air. Then the hollow thud of wood touching the bottom of the grave. Then the first shovel of dirt, falling like rain onto the polished surface. Coda shuddered. A sound rose from his chest. Not a roar. Something lower, deeper, more broken. A sound that the scientists would say was impossible. That lions do not possess the capacity for grief the way humans do. But everyone who heard it that day knew exactly what it was. A lament. David's hand tightened in Coda's mane. His own sobs mixed with the lion's mourning. 2 voices joined in a language older than words. Then something unexpected happened. A small figure broke away from the crowd. A girl, no more than 6 years old, with Grace's green eyes and stubborn chin. David's granddaughter, Emma. She had been hiding behind her father's legs throughout the ceremony, but now she walked forward with the fearless determination that only children possess. She held a piece of paper in her small hands. A drawing, done in crayon. A stick figure with white hair standing next to a large yellow shape that could only be a lion. The guards moved to intercept her. David raised his hand without looking. "Let her!" They stopped. Emma walked right up to Coda. The lion's head turned toward her, those amber eyes taking in this tiny human who showed no fear. She held out the drawing. "This is for you," she said. "I drew it for Grandma, but she said you would come, so I think she wanted you to have it." Coda lowered his head. He sniffed the paper, then the small hand that held it, and then, with a gentleness that made several mourners gasp, he pressed his forehead against her palm. His eyes closed. His breath came out in a long, slow exhale. Emma smiled through her tears. "Grandma said you were her first baby. She said you would remember." The lion stayed like that for a long moment, his great head resting against the hand of a child, receiving a comfort he could not ask for in words. Then Coda rose. He looked at the grave, now half filled with earth. He looked at David, still sitting in his chair, tears cutting rivers through the dust on his weathered face. He looked at Emma, who waved at him the same way Grace had waved 9 years ago. He walked to David and did something no one expected. He picked up the piece of braided leather that he had placed in the casket, the same leather that Grace had made for him all those years ago, and he dropped it gently into David's lap. Their eyes met one final time, and in that gaze, David understood. Keep this. She belonged to both of us. Remember her from me. Coda turned and began to walk away. His pace was slow, unhurried. The golden light of sunset painted his mane in shades of fire and amber. His silhouette grew smaller as he approached the tree line, the same trees he had emerged from less than an hour ago. David's voice cracked as he called out, "Coda!" The lion stopped. He turned his great head, looking back over his shoulder. 5 seconds, an eternity compressed into a single moment. Then he disappeared into the bush, swallowed by the savanna that had been his home, leaving behind only deep paw prints in the dry earth, and a story that would be told for decades to come. 6 months have passed since that day. David visits Grace's grave every week, bringing fresh flowers and sitting in the same wooden chair that he sat in during the funeral. Sometimes he talks to her. Sometimes he just sits in silence, watching the sun move across the sky. Strange things happen at that grave. Wild orchids appear sometimes, placed carefully on the headstone. No one knows who leaves them. The cemetery workers have checked, but there are never any human footprints nearby. Only the large, round prints of a cat. The rangers at the reserve report sightings. An old lion, scarred on his right hind leg, seen standing on the hill that overlooks the cemetery. He never approaches. He never threatens anyone. He just watches, sometimes for hours, before melting back into the tall grass. David knows who it is. He does not need confirmation. He used Grace's inheritance to establish a fund in her memory. He called it Coda's Promise. In 6 months, teams working under that fund have removed over 1,200 poacher snares from the reserve. 1,200 traps that will never again close around the leg of a curious cub. 1,200 chances for another Grace to find another Coda and give him the gift of life. The piece of braided leather sits on David's nightstand now, next to a photograph of Grace holding a lion cub in her arms, both of them looking at the camera with expressions of pure, uncomplicated joy. Some nights, David swears he can hear a sound carried on the wind from the direction of the savanna. A low, rumbling call that is not quite a roar, a sound that might be grief, or might be gratitude, or might be the only way a lion knows how to say, "I remember." Grace spent 40 years saving animals who could not save themselves. She never asked for recognition. never expected anything in return. She simply saw suffering and chose to act, again and again, until her body could not carry her anymore. But the love she planted did not die with her. It crossed 9 years of silence. It traveled kilometers of wild bush. It walked into a cemetery full of frightened humans and armed guards, risking everything just to say goodbye. Some connections do not need words. Some farewells do not need sound. And some promises are kept, even when the one who made them is no longer here to see. If this story touched your heart, subscribe and leave a like. Share it with someone who needs to remember that the love we give into this world is never, ever lost.